Good day, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, So Many Choices, So Little Time, Setting Strategies to Guide Your Tactics. Let me introduce our presenter for today, Rachael Bower. Rachael is the Director and PI of ATE Central at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Rachael.
Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here as always. We love doing these live events with you, and people are still joining, which is exciting. I'm going to just talk to you a little bit now about the AT program and AT Central before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes, or the seitan and potatoes if you're a vegetarian, of our presentation today. So just as a reminder, AT stands for Advanced Technological Education. It's a funding stream from the National Science Foundation, and the focus is on technician education. And most of these very innovative and exciting programs are based at community colleges. There are about 300 projects and centers currently funded, a little over that. And it's a real community. NSF sort of baked in a lot of support into the program as they created it, and there are lots of cross-cutting support projects and centers that have been created to help folks do the work of their project or center, amplify that work. And one of them is AT Central. We act as an information hub and archive for the AT community. And you can go online and check out AT Central and look at all of the resources and services that we have there. One of the things that we really focus on is all of the issues surrounding outreach and dissemination. As many of you probably know, NSF really likes to see anyone funded broaden the impact of what they're doing. So reach out to a variety of different populations and audiences. And so we couldn't be more thrilled to have Farra Trompeter from Big Duck, who's going to be talking to us today about strategies and methods for improving our outreach and dissemination and thinking about issues like branding. I'm going to introduce Farra and let her get into things here. So I'm turning it over to Farra now.
Thank you, Rachael. So as Rachael said, my name is Farra. I'm Vice President of a company called Big Duck, which I'll tell you about in a moment. For those of you who like to tweet during webinars, please feel free to tweet with me or with Rachael as we talk. Rachael and the ATE folks are at ATE Central, and you can always tweet with me at either Farra or Big Duck, or both. Welcome the conversation. So feel free to, as Mike and Rachael said, chat in questions and comments as we go, but you can also feel free to connect with us on Twitter. So Big Duck is a communications firm. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations. We are based in Brooklyn. This is a little peek inside our office. And we really work at trying to help organizations figure out how to use communications to achieve their mission. And typically our work falls in these areas, really helping organizations figure out how to build strong brands, strong campaigns, or strong teams, sometimes all three. And in fact, today's conversation is really trying to help give you the tools so you can understand how you can do your outreach and engage people as effectively as possible. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachael as we learn a little bit about you.
Yeah, we always like to start this. We have we're moving past the 35 participant mark here, so we have lots of folks on the line. We'd love to hear a little bit more about who you are as we work through this. And Mike is going to open up a poll, and you just need to click a button. Typically, we have lots of folks who are affiliated with ATE, but sometimes we have folks who are joining us from outside the community also. If for some reason you clicked on that other button, now is a great time to share with us who you are in the chat window. So if you don't mind typing in, you might be an evaluator or an administrator or somebody who's just writing a grant or thinking about writing a grant. So we'd love to hear more about you in that chat window. So folks are typing in, we have an evaluator, yep.
I know at Big Duck we put it on our website, so maybe you just heard about it through us too.
That's true.
Let us know.
There we go. Yep, there's a marketing strategist with a healthcare NPO. That might be somebody who came in through you. Consultant with a community college health program, enrollment strategist for School of Applied Technologies. You've got a lot of different people here. Mm-hmm. And an evaluator, as I said, grant writer. Great. So that's great. So as usual, we have a high percentage of folks who are affiliated with an AT grant, but we have lots of other people joining us today. Oh, a former co-PI trying to keep up with what's going on. That's wonderful to see. All right, thanks, Mike.
Great. So as we dig into today's conversation, what we want to do is first get all on the same page about what strategy is, and then talk about what you can do to really use strategies to guide your tactics. I think often when it comes to making decisions around outreach or communications, general tendency is a tactical orientation. Should my organization use Snapchat? Should we set up a group on LinkedIn? Whatever that question might be. Should we exhibit at the upcoming conference coming up? Those are all important day-to-day questions to ask. What we have found is if we can first start with everybody in an organization or a program getting on the same page as to really what are the strategies we should be using, then it can make decisions around tactics a lot easier, but also give us a framework from which to operate. The document on the right side that you can download has a number of worksheets that we'll refer to throughout today. If you've downloaded it, great. I would encourage you to hold in terms of sort of digging deeply into it for the content and hopefully maybe do it later. But for now, we'll reference them as we go. So we're going to start with another poll that Mike or Rachel is going to launch, and we really just want to understand how your program, your project, your center really currently conducts outreach. So whether you don't do a lot of outreach or perhaps you're doing it, you don't have a documented approach, you're very strategic, and you've got lots of rhymes and reasons behind your methods to your madness, or something else. So we'd love to hear where folks are on this question. And
Yeah,
it looks
absolutely.
Like, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I was going to say too,
like that way.
Yep, and if you click on other, feel free to chat in, how you'd like to describe what you're doing. We know from surveys that we've done of the community at AT Central that for many folks, they do not have a formal plan, so it's not surprising that we're getting a mix of those first two, Farah.
Yeah. And typically that what is currently answer number 2 tends to be the most popular one I see across all organizations of all different missions and focus areas.
Yeah.
So no one here seems to be bold enough to raise their hand and say they are incredibly strategic, but hopefully we're going to bring you an inch closer to feeling like maybe that's a box you can check later.
Somebody checked that box and then unchecked it, which was funny.
Oh, no.
No, it's okay.
You don't want to be the only one. You can be the one.
There you go. All right.
Great. And some folks are typing in, so definitely type in. And it sounds like there are things that are maybe done at a department level, but not at the entire school, university level. And that's certainly something. And again, Linnea, if I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, noted that some of their outreach is strategic, but sometimes you have to take advantage of a situation. And I want to say off the top, totally I agree. I mean, the purpose of having conversations like today is to give you that strategic framework and to hopefully get everybody in the room once or twice a year to agree what your big picture strategies are. But of course, sometimes opportunity comes and it is important to be reactive. What we're looking for, though, is giving you some tools so that you can be proactive as well.
And somebody just asked us how we define outreach, which is a great thing to start with.
Do you want to answer that, Rachel?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think that within the grantee community, lots of people outside the grantee community would probably use marketing. But within the grantee community, outreach is sort of a combination of communication strategies and marketing strategies and dissemination strategies used to broaden the impact and get the word out about the research results, programmatic results that you're having with your NSF work. So it's a little long-winded, but hopefully that helps, Christy. And Linnea just typed into that we don't always record results, which is a huge issue. Of course.
Yeah, I would say I often find people don't always track results. So there's even just sort of like setting up, a lot of times folks do, I can't tell you the number of times I see marketing or outreach tactics or things really being out there, and there's no way to even track what happened. There's no clear call to action. So sometimes folks are just doing things, and they are the right things, but they have no way to know if they work. So my turn to ask you all a question, which is, what is strategy? You hear that word. How do you define strategy? Say you had to get on the phone with a family friend or a significant other and say, I was on a webinar about strategy today. What is strategy? So chat in a phrase or a sentence that you would use to define strategy. Just want to see where you all are coming from on that. So it looks like multiple attendees are typing, so we will soon be seeing some results. So yeah, what is strategy? Just a phrase or a sentence that comes to mind in terms of a definition. So
long-range
here we
thinking,
go. Long-range thinking, yeah.
Overall plan.
Mm-hmm. We'll give it another minute or two.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of people noting a plan, right? It's well thought out. Mm-hmm. Coordinated plan.
Coordinated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
An approach.
I like this, Tanisha's. I would define strategy as a strategic way of thinking about how you're going to do something. Although, Tanisha, if you were in one of my classes, I'm an adjunct professor, I'd say you can't define a word with the same word. But you're pretty good.
But that's good.
So I'll just take strategic out of that, and we'll take that definition. So steps you take to achieve an outcome, goal-based, yeah. So feel free to keep typing stuff in. And we're going to ask some other questions, see where you all are coming from. And I give you a definition that we use at Big Duck, and later we're going to share some resources for you. We actually put together an ebook on how to achieve strategy, which some of this content comes from, and I would encourage those of you who are trying to really dig more into these tools or get your colleagues involved to consider sharing that ebook. So again, you'll note that at the end with the slides. So we define strategy, big picture, as the practice of defining what you want to achieve and identifying the best way to achieve it. So that when, you know, at the very highest level, that is what strategy is, right? Really making sure, again, setting, I think a few people talked about goals and outcomes. I sometimes like to think of the destination, you know, where are we trying to go and how are we going to get there? So that's kind of just a big global definition to have in mind as we go through all of this. So why should you care about setting strategies? You know, what we have found is that when you can apply strategies to what you're trying to do, particularly for anyone who is trying to communicate about your product or center and get the word out, that it really can be helpful, not just once a year to do in a plan, but really on an ongoing basis. And that if any part of your, you know, and if you think about who's out there representing your product or center, who's answering the phone, answering emails, updating Facebook, representing you at an information fair, all of these folks are representing you and are in essence communicators on behalf of the organization, and having them understand what the strategy is and being able to use it is really critical in being successful. So this is an interesting question that I'd love to have folks just sort of think a minute and then chat in. I want everybody, you can close your eyes if you'd like, join me on this meditative journey. We'll have Mike put back some music. You know, I want you to imagine it's let's say 3 years from now, right? It's 2022. It's February 26th, 2022. And your project or center has had a real boost in how it in its outreach or marketing approaches. What has that done for you? What do you see the future as? You know, what do you want the landscape to look like for your project or center in 2022 from the perspective of maybe participation, sustainability, whatever it may be? What kind of comes to mind? If you could just write a one sentence. In 2022, I hope our organization is X. Where do you want your organization to be in 3 years? So I hope I've set that up well. Rachel, feel free to chime in if not, but I see a few folks are starting to type that in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously for AT, because of the grant cycle, for some of them it could be, you know, applying for more, having the data to apply for more funding. Who knows? So it'll be interesting to see what people say, or, you know, having their curriculum distributed to X number of schools, or see what folks say here. I hope our organization has ability. Yeah. Data-driven strategies to inform marketing tactics and drive engagement and revenue. Wow. Significant number of organic shares of our content.
So Mary Ellen, I would encourage you to take that a step further, and as you all are writing these statements, it's helpful to sort of ask the why question, right? If there were more people who were sharing your content, what would happen for you, right? What we want to get a little further or higher up the ladder, depending on which way you're going. So if more people were sharing your content, what would happen? Maybe you would have an increase in requests for people to participate, or you would have more demand to participate in your programs than you could even meet. Like the phones were ringing off the hook, right? So sort of really looking at, as you all are thinking about these ideas, kind of why. So for example, Mike, in Mike's future world, right, there are lots of funding coming through, so you're less dependent on just one.
Right. Or DEBS, which is high enrollment and strong industry connections.
Right, exactly. So, again, I think it's really helpful as we start getting, we'll start honing into, what this year might look like for you and how you set strategies and tactics for that. But it can always be helpful whenever you're doing this kind of work to stop for a second and go 3 to 5 years out. And just remember that that's, I often use this analogy of a marathon. I don't know why I use this analogy, because I can barely walk a straight line without falling, let alone jog or run. But if I was to be a runner, I do know a marathon, right? It's 26.2 miles, is that right? So I know that it is a far destination one has to go to run a marathon, and when you run a marathon, you want to get to that finish line. But there are milestones and mile markers along the way. There's training you do to get there, and that training program gets broken down into bits and pieces. So imagine that sort of that finish line, and again, this year may only get you to mile marker 4, but there's this sort of 26 that we're trying to get to. So it's really always helpful to start with that end and then know what we're trying to do to then break that down into chunks. So again, what is the goal? What is ultimately the goal I'm trying to achieve, and what does success look like, right? Those are the questions that you should be pondering when you're thinking about that desired future state, that place you're trying to go. So anytime we do an outreach or communications plan, we always want to start with goals and objectives. And when we're thinking about goals for our communications or outreach efforts, it's important to start first with saying, well, what's the mission of our project or center, and have we already stated goals somewhere? As I was working on this content with Rachel, she noted that many of you, when you apply for funding in your grant proposal, you do expressly talk about goals that you're trying to achieve. So as you're trying to set the goals and how you might measure progress toward those goals with objectives, you want to think about what do I know I need to do? This is my mission, and this is what I've said I need to get done. Then you want to think about, you want to do some research. You want to understand, and research might look like some of these methods. You might look at other projects or centers that you may be competing with that are trying to reach the same people or the same funders as you. You want to talk to some people you've already engaged and find out what was successful in bringing them there. You might want to do a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats exercise or a SWOT analysis. Right, there's different research you can do to figure out what should that mile 26 be for you. And then along the way, you want to set, what are those milestones? How will I know I'm making progress toward my goal? And we always encourage people to use the SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound objectives. So we're not just saying, okay, we want to diversify our funding, but we might say, so if our big picture goal is to diversify our funding, we might say, by the end of 2019, I want to start receiving, $25,000 from individual donors giving us $500 or less, again, depending on what they may be. And we'll show you some examples in a moment. And that moment is now. So the definition of a goal is a big picture statement of what we're trying to achieve. And again, Rachel and I worked on some examples for you in gray here. And the objective are those measurable incomes that we're making progress. So why don't we pause for a second? Rachel, maybe you want to talk about these examples here.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that and interestingly, I just got a private chat from someone who said, when this slide came up, in thinking about the sort of goals and objectives, should this be something that we'd be working with our evaluator on? And I think both Farra and I would say absolutely, particularly because these are measurable goals. And if you're working on things like, long-term sustainability, or positioning yourself as, as the key person for water resource curriculum in the tri-state area, or whatever it is that you're trying to do in terms of these big picture goals. Those are things that can be worked into your evaluation plan. And what's nice about that, if they're a part of your evaluation plan, is that in a way you're probably setting yourself up to do a better job of tracking them, because your external evaluator will be helping you, right? So as you start to think about the big picture goals and then start to think about the measurable outcomes, working with that evaluator can be a really helpful thing.
So these are just some examples, and we're going to give you some worksheets. One of them is to get you to think about what your goals and objectives will be, but we're going to pause for a moment. If anyone has any questions that you want to sort of ask now, or if anyone has a goal or that they've thought about and they want feedback from Rachel or I or from the group, you can certainly chat that in. Just want to pause and see if there are any questions about the content we've covered so far, particularly around goals and objectives or anything else we've said.
We got that first question about working with evaluators. Anything else that folks would like to throw into the mix? Doesn't seem like it fair. I think we can move along.
I don't see the little chat bubble, so we'll keep going. So we set up our goals and objectives. Then we need to start thinking about our audiences. And we've spent some time talking about audiences in a previous webinar. And again, we've got a worksheet you can use in the take-home where you can think about a persona. But we're going to talk a little bit about audiences, and then we'll get into the heart of the conversation. So it's really important if our goal is that destination. Who do we need to reach and engage so that we can get to that place? So anytime we're creating communications or outreach strategies, we really need to know who we're trying to reach and what are the different ways we need to get there. So it's always important when we're thinking about who we're trying to reach to not just think about new audiences, which it's very important to get new funders, get new participants, get new partners, whatever that may be. But it's also important to sort of hold on to the people you already have. And what I see time and time again, I've been working with nonprofits through the lens of fundraising and communications for over 25 years. I've seen that there's a natural inclination to sort of go right to the new. And, frankly, holding on to and deepening the relationships with the people who already know us is certainly more affordable and also really tends to lead toward better results. Now, that doesn't mean I think we should only focus. You've got to do both. You've got to have a foot in both the old and the new. And, where you should emphasize, then that depends on sort of, again, your goal and what you might need to reach. So as you're thinking about audiences, think about who knows you, new people, and we want to encourage you to think about how they're seeing the world through their eyes. How do they see your product or center? Not only what we want them to know or what we want them to do, but what's in it for them. What does your project need that they need to understand? What do they care about? And what do we really want them to do? So as you're thinking about audiences, it's also helpful to break it down beyond just sort of big general groupings. So potential students or new funders. Here we've given you some examples. Again, female students interested in robotics or community college educators and admins. Funding agency program officers. So again, we're not just talking about funders, we're thinking about the program officers who are making that decision. So as we're trying to reach audiences, again, we want to think about all the things swirling around their life. And this is a fictitious, lovely woman that we use here. We'll call her Jenny. And Jenny's got a lot going on. She's trying to balance sort of having a family, working, taking care of herself, making time to enjoy what she likes to do. And she's got a lot on her to-do list. Reading your email, showing up at your event, all of the things we want her to do is sort of, number 322 on her to-do list. So how do we get on her radar and hopefully stay there? That's really what we're trying to do, is sort of pause for a second and imagine, what does she need to see? What does she need to hear in order to want to engage in our work or learn more about us, and then hopefully come back? So one exercise we often encourage folks to do is to create an audience profile. If any of you have ever been involved in a website design process, you may be familiar with creating a user persona. We really like to take that practice that folks are used to through websites and apply that to overall communications and outreach. And encourage you to again, not just name, for example, female college students interested in robotics, but to really break that down. Who is that person who represents that group? These profiles are often based on fictitious people that you're sort of are an amalgam of what you know, or sometimes we do research and we, for example, interview 10 different women who recently enrolled in our program, or maybe who requested information but never applied, and really find out kind of who they are, what they're looking for, and learn more about them. So this is kind of a summary of sometimes a grid I like to put up on a wall and do some brainstorming around. Here's a potential student. Rachel and I filled this out, right? So instead of saying, you know, potential student and just leaving it at that, we're calling him Bob. We've found a Bob on the internet and given him a picture. We haven't said he's, you know, in his 20s. We've given him a specific age. He's got a story here. There are things that he's looking for, things that are important to him. And perhaps, for example, in the case of Bob, he really cares about earning a good salary and taking care of his family. He's really looking to get a great job in high tech. He's probably heard of our community college if we're at a community college, but he hasn't heard about our project. And he's got a lot of perceptions that, and barriers getting in his way. He spends his time at his church as well as at his community center. He's on Facebook and Instagram. So these are just helpful to know. So as we think about what we want Bob to do is come to an open house event or maybe follow us on Instagram. So what do we need to do in order to make sure that happens? We want to start by thinking about people like Bob or whoever our profiles are, and then using that to get into some of what our strategies and tactics may be. So that's a sort of example of one, and we've created a worksheet for you that's in the handouts and the files on the right that you can download later. And this can be a great exercise to gather with at least another colleague, if not a group of colleagues, and do even better, do some research, whether that's through a survey or interviews, and really try and see what you can learn about the audience. But if nothing else, even just gathering folks in the room who know these audiences in different ways to fill out these profiles can be a great exercise. So as we're thinking about who we're trying to reach, we also really need to think about kind of where are they in their journey with us and where do we want to take them. So we like to think about something called a ladder of engagement. And if any of you out there have taken a marketing class, you're probably familiar with this. Sometimes there's also marketing funnel, customer journey. You may have heard similar terms. You know, as we're thinking about people who don't know us but should, or we're thinking about our ultimate goal, it can be helpful to start thinking about our audiences also on this path. You know, who are the people who don't know us but should? That's the unaware audience. They're really asking, what's in it for me? To get on their radar, you've got to really prove that you're making their life easier or better, whatever it may be. And then how do we get that person who doesn't know us but should to pay attention, whether that's coming to our website, following us on Instagram, whatever it may be, then start supporting, and financially, that might be literally giving us a grant or making a donation, or it might be signing up and participating as a student. And then eventually becoming the ultimate ambassador. And when somebody becomes an advocate, sometimes I think about staff and board in this role or really committed volunteers. These are people who are coming back to you and saying, how can I help you? So they're no longer, you don't have to prove to them what they can get out of knowing you or participating with you. They now are calling you up on the phone or sending you an email and looking to do whatever they can for you. And as you think about that future desired state, that place you really want to go, and then who you need to engage to get there, it can be helpful to pause and say, okay, where are they, where now are my audiences? Do I really, if I want to diversify my funding, I'll come back to Mike's example, well, maybe what I'm trying to do is get some people who've already funded us at a small level, their current supporters, to become bigger supporters. And so I'm trying to move my supporters to advocates. Or maybe if my goal is really around recruitment, I'm trying to reach people who haven't heard of us but should and start getting them to pay attention. So this can just be another lens to figure out where you should be spending your audience time. And it's also helpful to say, what is the problem I'm trying to address with my goal, right? What's getting in the way of me reaching my goal? Is it that there are not enough, I haven't made enough requests for funding, there are not enough funders that I know of that are funding this, I have to really make the case, right? What's the problem getting in the way of achieving your goal, and where do you need to engage people in order to reach that? We also have a worksheet on ladder of engagement that you'll be able to download, but I want to pause for a second, and just as you think about your project or center, if you had to pick a spot on that ladder that you really need to pay attention to, where is it? So Rachel's going to launch that poll, or Mike is, and we'll see where you vote.
Yeah. I'm not surprised that, you know, I think for a lot of folks in the AT program, obviously, we may be thinking about students or other faculty we're trying to engage. but could be funders too. So a lot of people in the first, oh, we got some advocates there too.
And those of you who are putting in unaware, I just want to reiterate a point that I didn't say earlier, which is I see a lot of times organizations when we say, who are you trying to reach with your outreach or your communications, and they say the general public. If ever that thought comes to mind, I want you to strike it, because reaching the general public is too expensive and too unwieldy for most of us. What we really have to, just keep in mind what I was saying, reach the group of people who don't know us but should. Right? Who are really, and the more specific you can get with your audience, actually the better your communications approaches will be, and it will be easier to make decisions about where you should be spending your time.
I think we can close that, Mike. Thank you so much to everybody for filling that one out. And I think we have a question break coming up, don't we?
Yeah, and so and we'll get there in a minute. I know there's been some questions coming through. Yeah. So again, what we've done for you, we've given you a worksheet where not only can you think about those profiles and create personas, but you can also think about who your audiences are along that ladder and think about what they need and what you can do to engage them. So let's get to some questions.
Absolutely.
Rachel,
so
do you want to surface those? I know there's been a few.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is, it's really an interesting question, and it's one that we struggle with at times too. And I think the ATE community, this whole issue of, how do you engage a population that, like, should you move? Ruth is asking about, she's a slightly older demographic, so her average age is 52. Not very social media savvy or oriented, but should she try to get them to move over to Twitter? Like, is that worth it, or how would you address that question, Farra?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, and I'm also going to try and find the document and post it at the same time and multitask. So give me 1 second while I do that. So the Pew Internet and American Life Project is a great resource for what's the latest data and trends on social media on a national scale. And the reason why I wanted to post that link, and I just quickly threw that out there, you'll see that there's a fact sheet on the latest social media use. What's interesting about this is we can see if you click that link now or later, you'll see that it sort of breaks down by age. I mean, what is, I think, surprising often for folks is that the average age of who's on social has certainly gone up. And there is a perception for a long time that it was only for younger folks, whereas the 65-plus age has been the fastest growing in terms of social media adoption. And so you can poke around this site later to take a look at that. But for example, on Twitter, just to use that example, 2/3 of the people on Twitter are under 50, according to the Pew Internet and American Life Project. Now, what you would want to do to answer this question are two things. First, you would want to understand your audience, understand what communications channels they are on, because I can look at this national data, but it may be different in your community or in your state. There may be other data that's freely available there to look at. But I think I like to look at first, what does the data tell me about where I should be spending my time based on the age, the gender, the race, the education. Again, if you poke around that Pew Internet link, it'll show you different ways to break down social media usage. But really, to answer the question is to go to that target audience of 52-year-olds who, demographics are a good place to start, but then we want to get into things like psychographics. What are the attitudes and beliefs and behaviors of the people we're trying to reach? And, take that average 52-year-old that, you want to get to take a specific action. And I don't know what that may be, Ruth, but whatever that may be, and then think about where you need to show up in order for them to see you, know you, and want to work with you. So for, I'm a few years shy of that. I'm 45, but I've been pretty active on social for a while, so I am on Twitter a fair amount. But it's possible that, as you get to do some research, you find that maybe folks are on Twitter and they want to see your point of view on certain policy issues or on certain things that are happening in the community. But maybe they're mostly on LinkedIn and they want you to help them with networking, and you should have a bigger presence on LinkedIn. Anytime you want to answer a question to this, I like to go back to the audience and understand not just what communications channels they are using generally, but would make sense for them to use in light of what you can offer them. because I'd rather see an organization generally take on 1 or 2 channels and do them well than be on every single channel there is. So that's kind of a long way to answer your question, but I generally would probably try not to move an audience to Twitter, but I would try and move your Twitter, your communications channel, to where the audience is, if that makes sense.
Farra, we had another really, and this is actually the second, somebody else chatted me about this. Louise was saying that she could use some tips on how to prioritize our desired audiences when you have several. And somebody else asked about prioritizing how much to work with each audience type. So a couple different questions: how to prioritize the desired audience, and how to think about, who gets the. I guess it's sort of the same thing, how much to work with each audience.
Yeah, it's, I'll try to answer that in a very general way without knowing everyone's particular situation, only to say it helps to go down another level if we were to work together. But I would say, going back to that goal, when you really think about, if this is the place I'm trying to get, this is the destination, my mile 26 or whatever it is at the end of that, the finish line of that marathon, and this is where I'm trying to get, who are the most important audiences that I need to engage to get there? Who are the people either that are going to be, again, depending on what that goal is, either running the race, supporting those runners, right? Who are the people that are both influencing the audience I need to engage, that are that audience, and really trying to come up with 2 or 3. If you had to limit yourself to the top 2 or 3, and oftentimes, if we're really sort of honing in on a priority goal or destination, those audiences might be different, but they could share some similar characteristics. If you find yourself with 2 or 3 very distinct audiences that, for example, have different behaviors, different needs, different practices, then I think the question comes down to, what do you really have the resources to engage well? And maybe starting off you might have 3 audiences you need to engage, but maybe you spend the first year on what we often call the low-hanging fruit. Who might be the easiest to engage more deeply or with a higher quality? Start by making some strides there and then bring in others. So that's, again, sort of a global way I like to think about it.
We just, Karen is segueing us nicely into communication channels. So I told her we kind of talk about that in a minute anyway. We didn't have any other specific questions though, Farra, so I think we can.
So let's do that, and then we can sort of come back to channels. Great, thank you everyone, and hopefully these answers are helpful. So we've got our goal and we've got some audiences, and the next question is, how will we reach and engage them, right? That's really the big ticket question. So as we think about what goals and objectives are, then we get into specific strategies, right? So we talked about a definition for strategy globally. Now when we're thinking about outreach or communication strategies, what do we mean? What we mean are approaches, right? What are the approaches that are going to help us guide our decisions and help us lead toward our goal, right? They are meant, so if what we're trying to do is come up with things like create an ambassador strategy, because I know the biggest source of my new funding comes from word of mouth. So the more people who already know me are talking about me, more likely will be, so let me get those people who are already talking about me, let me get them to talk about me more, right? So creating an ambassador program might be a strategy. A good strategy isn't set up a group on LinkedIn. That is a tactic. Right? So if you've written something when you start working on a strategy that sounds very specific and just answers the question how you would do it, then it's not a strategy. So, what you're trying to do is think about what are the biggest steps I need to take, the approaches I need to take to reach that goal. If I've done a SWOT analysis, it can be helpful to look at that to help me guide what would make sense. Again, playing off our strengths and opportunities or combating our weaknesses or threats. And so, for example, my strategies might be engage new industry partner prospects or make it easy to get involved. Make it easy to get involved. I don't know how I'm going to do that. Well, now I need to figure out what tactics I'm going to employ to make it easy to get involved. But I may have said that make it easy to get involved is an important strategy because I'm trying to get that unaware audience to become observers. And I know that if it's not quick and easy, they're not likely to do it. So if strategies are my approaches, then tactics are the specific activities within each strategy I need to conduct. And this is where we get into the nitty-gritty. This is where we get detailed. And it's important as we think about tactics we might take to advance a certain strategy that we pause and consider, what do I have the time for? What do I have the money for, the staff for, the access to, the tools? And make sure that we're sort of being realistic and pragmatic. It's also important to think about who my audiences are. So to go back to that question about Twitter, you know, we want to pick channels that make sense for our audience, that don't just make sense for us. So some of the, you know, we might say if we're really trying to reach more prospects, we might start inviting them to campus events and have specific open houses for them, or expand an existing advisory board so we can learn more. Right? There's lots of different things we can do as part of that strategy. So here's an example where it might all come together. The goal is to increase participation for our project. Our measurable objective is to get 15 students to register for a very specific program every semester, or maybe even, you know, by the fall. Our strategy is going to make it to make our project or center more visible before students have declared an interest in technical education. And then one of our tactics is going to be to host an ongoing introductory series during College Orientation Week for new students and transfers to try and get on their radar. So that's just kind of a way they might all ladder together. And hopefully, I'm going to pause here. Hopefully, that's kind of adding up. So I know there was a question about channels. We can sort of talk about now. We have a little bit more content too, but happy to sort of pause now and either answer questions people have already chatted in or any new ones.
I think that somebody else asked me about, in thinking about, you know, all of these strategies and tactics, who else should they be engaging with to kind of come up with the list? I mean, obviously, you're going back to, for many of us, we're going back to our grant, right? We're looking at the overall goals there. To, you know, if the big goal is to, you know, recruit and retain more female students, we know what we're starting with, and then we get into, as you said, the tactics and the strategies and then the tactics. But who else do you think people could work with to kind of think through that? To me, other colleagues on campus would be good, possibly even administrators, depending. Industry partners.
Yeah, I mean, I would think about, I guess what comes to mind for me is first, who knows the audience we're trying to engage best? Because they may, whether that is in our current project or center or is in another department on campus, because they may be able to bring some fresh thinking. And then it's sort of, are there other projects or centers, maybe even in other cities or communities across the country, or maybe even in other countries, that have done something successful? You hold them up as a model. You've heard that they have really great sources of sustainability, or they are, you know, they can't meet all the demands for their program. All these people are applying, and really just having a conversation, asking them what works, especially if they're in another community. They won't feel, you know, let's say they're halfway on the other side of the country or 3 states away, they won't feel that same, potentially may not feel that same competition for you. I know ATE has an amazing book of all the different programs and projects and centers. What is there, Rachel, over 150? I'm trying to remember what was in that book that you sent me.
Yeah, the book lists all of the centers and then a subset of the projects, because there are about 300 altogether, but in the book there's more like 60 or 70 listed, yeah.
Okay, so I was right in between.
Yeah, but it gives you a good overview for sure, and the AT Central map is a really good place to go and look for people near you or in your field who might be folks you can turn to ask questions of. That's a really good point, Farra, to just look to the community.
Yeah, and then the third group to look for is the audience themselves. I mean, a lot of, you know, think about the people who you've already converted, people who are already on that kind of supporter advocate path. Who are the people that are like your, you know, your most loyal members of your community, the people that love you, the people that maybe they're alumni of your program, maybe they're people who've been funding you for years, or fund programs like yours but haven't funded yours, and just ask them. Ask them where they spend their time, what do they think of your current communications, what kind of things would they like to hear from you more on, As I think the more you can get both people who know your audience, but even more get your audience to answer some of these questions for you. I know sometimes people will do very informal group discussions. They'll have pizza in the office and ask folks to come in. People often are happy to gather for food. Others do a survey where they might raffle off a gift card to Amazon or whatever it may be. The more you can ask and hear from people who either know your audience or are your audience, the better. I know we've got about 15 minutes left. I would suggest, why don't I finish this content and then we can take any other questions that come in. Does that work for you?
That sounds great, Farrah. Let's keep pushing forward.
So what's the right channel for me? And we've already had some conversation about this, and I know that Karen submitted this question. You know, whether there's, you know, are same channels hitting different audiences, different channels hitting the same audiences, and we can talk a little bit about that. So when you're thinking about which communications channels to use, it's important to stop and say, you know, who am I trying to reach? How do I grow the people who know me or could know me? So, you know, and it's not just, you know, the content you share is really important, and we spend a lot of time thinking about producing content, writing a blog post, creating a book or an ebook, whatever, putting on a workshop, whatever it is we're doing, but it's also really important to make sure we're disseminating that information in the right place. So there's a lot of different, you know, we follow a model we created on nonprofit branding and communications called brand raising, and we think about channels in 5 general categories: in person, in print, online, on air, and mobile. For example, on air, podcasts have really taken off. Whether or not your organization should podcast comes back to, again, the audience you're trying to reach and what they're trying to do, and if you can produce content that is going to be of meaning to them, and something they're going to want to tune into. So what are all the different, you know, I think it can help if you're having a moment where you're stuck and you want to brainstorm, even just writing those 5 categories on the wall, and seeing what kind of ideas they trigger. What do you know that's coming up? We've listed some ideas here for you to think about, but how can you use these different communications channels, and in what way, and where can you repurpose? So if you know, once people see your program in action, they fall in love with it, but it's getting people in the door to see it, that's really hard, then maybe you need to make a short 90-second video that really shows your project in action, and then start figuring out where you embed that video on your site, share it, put it on YouTube, share it on Facebook, right? What are all the different things you can do with that same content? So these are just some sort of high-level groupings of channels to consider. And again, I often get questions about social media, which is why I shared that Pew link earlier. You know, just saying social media, there are, you know, every day I feel like there's a new social media channel or a new app to ask about. I think, again, you want to start with where's your most bang for your buck? Where does it make sense for you to really appear based on your audience and what they're looking for that you can offer? So again, lots of people may be on Twitter, but are the right people that you're trying to reach on Twitter, and are they on there for you, or are they on there for like the latest news and the latest controversy? And if your organization isn't controversial or using a lot of current news items, maybe it's not worth you spending your time there, and it's more important for you to spend your time elsewhere. Now, I don't know if that's true. That's where it comes down to figuring out your audience and your community. And as you select a channel, these are just some things to think about. First, you want to just pause and do an audit of the communications channels you're already using. Particularly if they are online communications channels, you have lots of data available to you, whether that's through Google Analytics. If you have an active email program, hopefully that's through an email tool where you can find out things about open rate, click-through rates, unsubscription rates, list size growth. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, many of these have their own analytics. You can see what content is doing well. Is there engagement, not just people clicking on things, but are they then converting to what the action you want them to take? And think about, okay, so here's how we're doing on our current channels. What are some of the new channels we're thinking about? And then ask ourselves, does this make sense given who we're trying to reach and what we're trying to do and what we have time for? You know, some of these communications channels to use really well takes a considerable amount of time, And my guess is if you're like anyone else I've ever talked to when it comes to these things, you never have enough time in the day. So really sort of honing in on where you should spend that time. And then pick the right mix of channels and making sure that you put regular processes in place to either once a month or once a quarter pause and evaluate what's working and what isn't, and then making changes.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll wait till a question. I was just going to say, Ruth had asked, going back to the previous slide, she had asked, once you decide on a channel, how can you test it before going big with it? Which is tricky.
It sort of depends on the exact channel, how you might test it. So for example, I've seen some organizations who are debating going on Instagram who might go on Instagram softly. So they set up a page, they start, maybe liking other accounts, posting some things, using hashtags or tagging other accounts to be seen and seeing if there's traction for them there. And then maybe after a few weeks, then putting a link to their Instagram page on the bottom of their email, on the bottom of their website, advertising it. It really depends on kind of what the channel is and what the test might look like. Some organizations just go out there and do it, and then take what they've learned and apply it as they evolve the specific channel. So it kind of depends what the channel is and what you're trying to do, what testing might look like. But feel free to write a more specific question, Ruth, if there's a specific channel you're thinking about, and if we have time, happy to chat about it. So I want to quickly ask everybody, when you think about all the 5 groups of channels I noted, in person, in print, online, on air, and mobile, based on your, if you had to pick one audience and that goal of what you're trying to do, which general category do you think is the best type of channel for you? So we're going to launch a poll just to get a sense of where everybody is.
Yeah, and if you have some other idea too that you feel like we've left off out of the mix, please feel free to click on that and put it in the chat window again. A lot of folks doing online, not surprising.
Nope. I'm actually surprised that in person it's coming up there, but it's not one of the primary. And I think as for many of you who have an actual, again, it comes back to what your goal is. But if many of you when you have a project or center, I imagine converting some of the students who are on your campus or letting more people know that you exist is a helpful thing, and having people come on campus, come sit in on classes. But certainly I know that online, most people are starting their journeys and learning about organizations through web searches, social, email, etc. Great. So why don't we close the poll? Let me. We only have a few more minutes. Let me wrap up the content we have to share, and then we'll spend the rest of the time on Q&A. So as you bring all this thinking together, we've got another worksheet for you in the handouts where you can really just start by saying, what is that problem I'm trying to address? Not enough people are applying for our program. Not enough people are enrolling, or once they have we've accepted them. We only have funding from one source. We need to diversify. What's a problem we're trying to address? Or that might be getting in the way of that future desired state we're thinking about. And then, again, how do we set our goal, our objectives, our strategies, and tactics in order to address that? So hopefully this is a good summary worksheet to bring it together. So before we answer any lingering questions, I just want to quickly go through what else is in this deck, and then we'll spend our last few minutes answering questions. So just some resources we have for you. ATE Central has a great online outreach kit with many tools, including an overview of different communications, things you can do, things like writing a mission statement, which we talked about in our last conversation, but also media outlets. And one of my favorite things they have is this social media directory. So you can, for those of you, many of you checked online, and if you're debating Twitter or Flickr or surprise, some of these groups may have Google+. I suspect that might be going away soon. But as you think about what you're out there doing and whether you should set up a YouTube channel, for example, taking a look at some of these other programs could be really helpful. At Big Duck, I mentioned we've got an ebook on strategy where a lot of this content comes from. If you just go to bigducknyc.com/strategy-ebook, you can download this PDF for free. You can also, if you can't find it right away, just bigducknyc.com/insights. You'll see lots of tools we have available. We also have a podcast series we started recently, and a few months ago we had two of our strategists, Laura and Gail, who Rachel has met, recorded a whole interview with our CEO on what is strategy. So that maybe it's a quick 10-minute conversation that might be helpful for those of you as you circulate this content around. And want to make sure that we don't leave without saying thank you, but I'm actually going to backtrack up back to our question slide and spend our last few minutes in answering questions.
Tanisha actually had a really interesting question. She was saying, can you give a few evaluation tactics? I often feel if I'm disseminating a lot, but I'm not evaluating enough or reporting on successes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, it really depends on what that call to action is. So let's say an organization puts lots of flyers and posters up around campus for a specific thing. Instead of just sending me to, your website.org, sending people to a specific page where you can track page views that ultimately then hopefully went to conversion to download, like for example, to download the strategy ebook, right? I can see how many people go to that page and how many people actually submit the form to download that ebook. Then I can evaluate how well are people coming to that page, how many people who view that page are converting to people who download that, how many of them are joining our email list, right? That's an example of how I would do that. I would say to the second part of your question is, not just reporting on the data. So for example, if I went to my boss and said, okay, it looks like 25% of the people who visit our ebook page actually download it. Well, that's a good point, but what is that in context? So for example, last month, was it 50% and all of a sudden something happened? Or is the average on our other page 50% and now we're really low at 25%? Or actually every other page is 10% and wow, this page is doing really well. Is there anything we can learn? So it's important to not just look at the numbers, but to give, when you're presenting those numbers, to give it context and to help people understand what the implications of that data is. I think the mistake I see is that a lot of people will just report on data and not either try to extract insights from it or use it to compare. Whether that, often comparing to yourself this year compared to last year or whatever it may be can be really helpful, and going back to that goal. So it doesn't matter how many people are seeing a thing or on your email list if you haven't raised more money or gotten more people to join the program or whatever the goal is. So I hope that makes sense.
I think it does. I would remind everyone, too, that for any kinds of evaluation questions, Evaluate is a great resource. They're an evaluation center. I'm thinking that maybe we have, speaking of evaluation, we have a little survey that we'd like everyone to take. And I'm thinking while we continue to chat, maybe Mike can load that survey. So while we're, there we go. So that the survey should have opened. You should see it. It's probably opening in a different window, and if you don't see it, if it doesn't open for you, Mike will usually
It just opened for me, so I think it's working.
For me too, but sometimes it doesn't, and Mike will sometimes put the survey link in the chat box too in case anyone has a question. Somebody asked about oh, no worries, Louise. And you'll also get a link to the survey, I believe, in the follow-up email from us, if you want to take it then. Somebody asked about recommendations on length for podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw Ruth
12 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, and that's, Big Duck's podcast is probably about 10 to 15 minutes long, each episode. And what we do is we make sure our podcast shows up in iTunes for folks that use, Mac and Apple products, on Google Play for folks with Androids, and also on Spotify. And we host it through a tool called Fireside, so we can track downloads of certain episodes, what's happening, and we also we have each episode transcribed, and when we posted the podcast on our website, so people can listen to them on our website, they can also read them, which is a great thing to do for accessibility, but also great for content that then hopefully can bring more people to your site through search engines.
There you go.
So Rachel, we probably have time for, I guess, one more question since it's 1:59.
Yeah, I have one other question that might be relevant to folks. Basically, in thinking about the channels, is there any sort of default set that people try if they don't have any data to rely on? So if you're just starting out and you have nothing to kind of go on because you're new, what would you recommend in that channel, that list of channels that you put up, the 5 different areas? Do you feel like, obviously people should reach out, sort of try to understand who their audiences are, but do you feel like there's a nice mix that people can sort of start with?
Sure. I mean, again, sort of average organization, and then you can tell me, those of you more deeply involved in the ATE world, if this would hold true for you. I would say having a website, or at least a landing page within an organization's website, using some kind of email tool, and hopefully emailing people, if not monthly, at least once a quarter. Probably having a page on Facebook. So in the world of online, I'd say, likely starting there. And then if you're a place that people come into thinking about what your space is, but probably having some kind of printed tool you can hand out or email people. So that might be a postcard or a flyer, something really simple you could give out at exhibit fairs. You can mail to people if they request. I'd probably start by that kind of in print and online.
Nice. Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense, and for the new, that's something we might, it's a nice thing for us to create for new ATE grantees, so maybe that's something we'll do, is like a cheat sheet, what you could do, your first set of channels. A nice idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I know people are starting to drop off because we're a little past the hour. Thanks to everyone, and thanks so much, Farra, for both of these webinars. Remember, folks, you can go back and listen to the prior webinar if you didn't get a chance on AT Central. I think that's the official end to our webinar. Mike usually comes on and
thank you all for participating. Great questions.
Yeah, great questions.
Thanks, Rachel and Farra. Excellent job today. Great interaction in the chat windows, and reminding everyone we will automatically send out a link to this recording and to the slides as well, and that link to the strategy tactics worksheets if you didn't have a chance to download it today. Thanks for joining today. That officially ends our podcast. Rachel and Farra, thank you again. I'm going to leave the system open for about 2 more minutes as people finish the survey. So goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Take care.